I thought was right, but always there comes the assurance you have created in me. From all over the South, white students wrote Carver of their efforts for racial justice. For example, one of Carver's girls led to the formation of a biracial study group at the Women's College of North Carolina and wrote him of her hopes that it would act as a leavening lump in the student body. Often, the students wanted to go further than the college administrators would allow. From Texas Tech came one such report. We have been informed by the president of the college that it is all right to discuss justice for the Negro, but we must be careful about discussing justice with the Negro. That would be admitting equality, which would not do in this part of the country. Significantly, many of the family continued their efforts towards racial justice long after leaving school. Several became liberal ministers. One argued for greater appropriations for black education in the Texas state legislature. Another wrote a prize-winning editorial for the Roanoke, Alabama Leader in 1956, urging his readers to remember the precepts of Christianity in the midst of the racial turmoil that had struck that town. Numerous other children took stands, both large and small, against racial intolerance, and at least one risked his life for his beliefs. Howard Kester, one of Carver's children, embarked on many dangerous missions for brotherhood through his affiliations with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Socialist Party, the NAACP, and other organizations. He investigated lynchings and aided black and white sharecroppers in forming a biracial Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas. Such activities didn't endear him to Southern whites, and his life was frequently in jeopardy. Actually, on so many occasions that Carver once told him how to prepare a suicide powder from a common plant. He later told me that he was glad he never had to use it, and that Carver was one of the greatest influences on his life. Carver's influence as an inspirer of young men and of old men is an intangible but significant legacy, and one of the many things for which he should be remembered. As two of Carver's children wrote, to the world, you are known as one of the greatest of all scientists, but to your boys, you are known as the spiritual guide to whom each can turn in times of doubt and discouragement. And, another wrote, marvelous are the miracles you have performed in the laboratory, but more marvelous still are the miracles you have wrought in the mind and heart of hundreds of men and women. Thank you. Okay, I've got my watch upside down. Do you want to take any time for some questions? Okay, if you're not in a hurry to leave, I'll be glad to take any questions or answer any questions.
You commented about Carver's relationship to his students and a bit about his relationship with Washington. Do you have any insight into his relationship with his peers? Did he have collaborators, people that he worked with in his programs?
Yes. That could be a very complicated question because it depends upon which peers you're talking about. He had very close ties with a number of white agriculturalists that were headed agricultural experiment stations. The Tuskegee Agricultural Experiment Station that he ran was the only all-black agricultural experiment station. And to some extent, I think he maybe even got more attention. He went to the meetings of the directors of agricultural experiment stations, and he probably got even more attention because of his color than he would otherwise. But he developed relationships with many of these and was in correspondence with them on a regular basis. Some much more closely than others, and some resented. There were some white agricultural researchers that resented the publicity that Carver got later on. But he did work very closely with other agricultural scientists. He also, Yeah, if you're talking about his fellow faculty members, I'm not sure what who you're referring to. He had some close relationships with some of the faculty members. There was some, especially in the early days, there was some resentment of Carver by other faculty members because he was paid more than some of the other faculty members. He was paid an extravagant salary of $1,000 a year. And finally got a raise to $1,200 a year, which is what he was making when he retired, when he died in 1943. So, but he got a larger salary. He had more education from a predominantly white school, and he also, when he first came to Tuskegee, he didn't plan on staying there. He was going to come in. It was sort of his mission field. He was going to come in and he was going to establish an education. An agricultural education program, and then he wanted to go on and return to his art or get his PhD in botany, one or the other. And he didn't make any bones about it, when he came in, so that he created some friction, and he was asking for more space than the average faculty member because he had all of his fungi and collections that he had, and he needed places to do his art and things of that sort. And he tended to be somewhat of a loner. He had dozens and dozens of relationships that he maintained by correspondence with former students and these white students, but also with other agriculturalists that he came in contact with. Anybody who was around Carver or stayed in touch with Carver for very long eventually became his friend. He had that sort of gift of turning acquaintances into friends, and turning friends into disciples to a large extent. Any other questions?
Could you talk about his experience in ROC?
Oh, yeah. I even thought about just doing that, but I was trying to fit it into the theme of the week. He had mixed experiences here, too. The student body was pretty much supportive of Carver, apparently from the records that survive. He did encounter some incidences of discrimination, but in many cases the students stood up for him. One example that comes to mind was in the cafeteria. Carver came in and went over to a table that was occupied by a number of white students, and of course all white students since he was the only black student, and that he knew, and he went to sit down, and the student who was described as having newly arrived from the South that was sitting at the table made this big show of gathering up all of his eating stuff and leaving the table when Carver sat down, and went over and sat at another table. And according to the story, when he went over and sat at the other table, everybody at that table made a big show of rattling all their stuff together and getting up and leaving that table and leaving him sitting there by himself. So there were some, Carver one-on-one was a very seductive personality. And he had, he was very active in campus affairs. He wrote the class poem, he acted in class plays, he was in the literary societies, he participated he was a trainer for the football team, just about every kind of student activity. There does appear one line that the students would not let him cross, however, and of course that was dating and courtship, or anything that resembled that. An interesting incident happened when the male literary society he was a member of was going to have a joint program with a female literary society. And they were going to make a processional into the hall with, a male member of one society escorting the female member of the other society. And it was, the guest of honor was the governor of the state. And so they gave Carver the honor of escorting the governor, which of course, solved the problem of not having him escort one of the white women in. But he apparently impressed faculty and students here from both by his personality and his talents. Mm-hmm.
Was he segregated from attending certain classes
No.
or having to sit outside of
I have, nothing that I have seen in any of the records indicates that he was segregated in any of the classes. Now, at first they had some housing problem arrangements. They didn't know what to do with him there, and they found a room for him where he would be by himself. But, you know, there was, he was more likely to, you know, to face unofficial discrimination in the eating establishments and all around in the town and places like that. That's where most of any of the record of him being segregated or Jim Crow came, was off campus when he was with fellow students going places, and they, you know, got very upset when that happened to him. But now he not only, as I say, not only participated fully in all the classes, but he was made you know, he participated fully in all the campus activities as well, except for courtship.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that Carver had a very strong theoretical background in science here at Iowa State, and yet at the same time you note that he was a deeply religious man. How did he reconcile these two things in his career? And secondly, did he ever rely upon religion to answer what he couldn't prove?
I think he was a very spiritual person. He did not have any kind of fundamentalist religious orientation. He really never even had a denominational religious orientation. And consequently, as I say, he didn't see any conflict between his creator, is what he called God, and science. His creator apparently was kind of an amorphous creative force. And incidentally, he was not forced to make a choice on this thing at Iowa State either, because one of his professors was James Wilson, who later became the Secretary of Agriculture under McKinley and Taft and Roosevelt. And Wilson had the same sort of ideology. As a matter of fact, he and Carver and several other students and faculty had regular prayer meetings together. So that, you know, Wilson, who was one of the leading professors here, also had that sort of orientation, which explained. Now you've got to understand when you're talking about Carver and using his use of science. I believe that, as I said before, if he had followed his scientific inclinations, he probably would have become involved in hybridization experiments and in mycology. Those were the things that he was particularly interested in and adept at. When he got to Tuskegee, what he basically focused his attention on was, you know, the horrendous plight that landless farmers and sharecroppers and tenant farmers and poor blacks in general faced in the rural South. And so what he practiced there was what he called cook stove chemistry. And he really didn't get involved in scientific theory and all of this kind of thing. Most of what his early work was very practically oriented towards providing poor sharecroppers with items that they would have to have paid money for. You know, he got known for all of the 300 and something uses of peanuts and all of the usages of all of this, that, and the other. But he didn't really intend for them to be commercial products at first. What he was trying to do was to break the cycle of debt and poverty, or help break it by, some of you may be aware of sharecropping and the whole cycle of debts and debt peonage and all of this kind of thing. And they were forced to borrow against their future crops in order to get things to live on and materials to grow. And that kept them trapped. And what he was attending, for example, he got interested in peanuts first. because it provided protein. It was a source of protein, and most of these poor farmers couldn't afford meat. And it also did things for the soil, nitrogen fixation and things in the soil that he wanted done. He practiced natural fertilization of various kinds, and he taught them how to use native clays to make paints and stains. And so, you know, there was no conflict. I mean, he wasn't doing the kind of highly specialized, as I said, he was a generalist in an age of specialization. He wasn't doing the kind of highly specialized theoretical research in which there would have developed any kind of conflict. Mm-hmm.
What motivated you to study it?
That's kind of embarrassing to have to admit. No, as a graduate student, I was interested in, my field was African American history, and that's what I was interested in. I was in graduate school at Auburn University, which is 25 miles from Tuskegee. And all of Carver's papers, or the bulk of Carver's papers, are at Tuskegee, which meant it was about a 35-minute drive from where I live. And my major professor discovered that there had been no scholarly biography done of Carver, so he suggested it. And I had really done my master's thesis on another African American at Tuskegee, Monroe Work, who was a black sociologist and an activist of some sort. He'd been a member of Du Bois's Niagara movement and all of this kind of thing. And I really wasn't very excited about the Carver thing at first, because I saw him as basically that accommodationist achiever that was the stereotype that, and that's all I saw. And I just didn't think he would be a very interesting or inspiring person, and I was wrong. As I said, nobody came in contact with Carver for very long without falling under his influence, and I had to work very hard to not be seduced myself when I got into his private correspondence. He was a fascinating man, and he was involved in so many different kinds of activities. It's almost impossible to give a capsule of Carver. But, I did it for career purposes. Here was a major figure whose papers were readily available. And yet I became so involved in it that I really felt like he had moved into my house with me. I joked around with some friends and said that, I had this horrible luck with house plants before I started working on Carver. They'd all die on me. And I said, since I started working on Carver, they're just flourishing. I'm propagating new plants, all this sort of thing. I think Carver's spirit has moved in and is taking over my plants. And one of them pointed out, no, you probably have just been reading his bulletins and have discovered that plants need water and sunshine and things like that.
I'd like to thank Dr. McMurray for enlightening us on George Washington Carver, the man, the educator, teacher. I'd like to remind everyone that there is another keynote address tonight, a keynote address tonight. Dr. Gloria Scott, the president of Bennett College, will be speaking tonight. Her topic is higher education in a democracy, and it will be here also. So I encourage you to come back and join us then. Thanks.